In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Andy was a child participant in Project Pegasus, which was the US time-space exploration program at the time of the emergence of time travel in the US defense technical community. Andrew is on a crusade as a lawyer and statesman to have the US government disclose its time travel secrets. He believes that lobbying the US government to declassify its secret teleportation capability so that teleportation can be adopted globally as the leading form of civilian transport is the most important environmental cause of our time. In 2016, Andrew D. Basiago will be a candidate for President of the United States under the banner Andy 2016, A Time for Truth. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you for coming on to this Skype interview for us today.
Well, thank you, Christiane.
Been watching quite a lot of your work recently and it got me beyond intrigued, I can say. And one of the questions I was thinking about is, why were you chosen? I mean, there's so many children. What made you extra special?
Well, I had some special abilities, but let me go back to the initial factors. My late father, Raymond, shortly after graduating with a BS in electrical engineering from Lehigh University in 1951, after the famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C., by 9 extraterrestrial craft that had been clocked on radar at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia as traveling at 7,000 miles per hour and also exhibiting such properties as disappearing at one location in the sky and then reappearing elsewhere in the sky, had the unusual experience of having a U.S. military officer appear at the side of his desk at Okanite Company in Paramus, New Jersey, where he was working in a non-defense technical capacity. But my father was brilliant, not just in engineering, but in mathematics and physics, which made up part of his course of study at Lehigh. So this officer instructed him that the next Monday morning he should report not to Okanite, but to Curtis Wright in Wood Ridge, New Jersey, where he was assigned to the ramjet engine project. The ramjet was a supersonic craft that it was hoped would be able to chase the extraterrestrial craft out of the Earth's atmosphere and even operate in the near-Earth environment. And my dad was tasked with the responsibility of designing a metal alloy that would enable the craft to operate at those speeds, both in the atmosphere and in space, without melting from friction from molecules of air in the atmosphere and molecules of space dust in space, to literally sort of scoot the flying saucers away from our planet. The lives of U.S. airmen were sometimes lost in those activities during the early saucer flap of the 1950s and 60s. And so he continued to work in classified defense-related engineering capacities, so that at the time of my birth, in September of 1961, my father had already worked on several very sensitive aerospace projects with reporting requirements to the CIA, the Air Force, the Navy, and so forth. Now, in early childhood, I entered kindergarten at age 4 in September of 1966, and then quickly turned age 5 because I was born in September of 61. So prior to my entry into kindergarten, I had been exhibiting non-ordinary abilities, that is to say special abilities, at our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, USA, that my father had witnessed. One of the things I was doing, I was going down into his carpentry shop in our cellar, and I was listening to him thinking to himself, and then talking to him with knowledge of what he was thinking about. In other words, he became aware that I was telepathic and I was picking up his thoughts and then saying things relative to what he was thinking. He also came out of the cellar one time into our rec room, which was on the ground floor of the house, and he saw me, it's not levitating, but just causing several of my small toys, my alphabet blocks and some Tinker toys, to hover 3 feet off the ground. What I had done is pick them up and place them about 3 feet off the ground, and I was not only causing them to hover, but some of the toys were actually orbiting around each other in the way that our Earth orbits the sun. So I had either the latent abilities of things human beings used to do, or the incipient abilities of the so-called indigo children. I like to say that I wasn't a trailing edge baby boomer. I was a leading edge indigo. And my father was clearly an expert in physics. He had studied it at one of the world's leading engineering universities, and he was working in it. By then, around 1964, he had moved on to the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, where he repeated many of Nikola Tesla's teleportation experiments, his Vortal teleportation experiments that Tesla had been working on going back to 1899 during his famous stay in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So my father was not just a defense technical engineer. He was an expert on some of the new applications in quantum physics that were coming along. So I think that what must have happened is he must have informed the classified defense technical community. This would be the group of physicists, engineers, and engineers who were working on new weaponry and new ways of gathering intelligence in an EM spectrum in which we pick up about 1% of what's visible in the EM spectrum. So they were working on espionage devices where they could see things that were in the invisible range of the electromagnetic spectrum. And they began to work on devices that would enable us to have a counterforce ability vis-a-vis the extraterrestrials, who, for example, were in one place in the sky, and then they would blink out and immediately show up somewhere else in the sky. So they began working on essentially what we might broadly caption as time travel devices. So I know that my father had passed along my special abilities to the United States Defense Department because he began taking me to some of these classified engineering locations in New Jersey in the summer after my kindergarten year, which was the summer of 1967. So clearly a file had been made of me because, Project Talent was searching for young Americans of high intelligence, high psychic ability, and evidence of native political ability, basically those who will be the leaders of our generation. And so I know that my name must have ended up in some file involving the indigo children that were emerging at that time, evincing these special abilities. But I never really talked to my father about why I was selected for the program. The bottom line was that I was, and I did so as the son of a U.S. aerospace engineer with reporting requirements to the CIA and other intelligence agencies. And that was in the nature of what government officials, intelligence community members, and military officers were doing in that Cold War context. They were basically volunteering some of their most intelligent progeny into these government projects because the U.S. government was very concerned about two perceived threats. They knew we were being visited by extraterrestrials, and they didn't know what the agenda of these different extraterrestrial races were. And they were also very concerned about World War III between the United States and the former Soviet Union. They actually believed that the number one military threat to the continental United States was probably not either a limited or an all-out nuclear war with the USSR, because that would lead to the destruction of the former Soviet Union as well. So it was believed that we were in a stalemate. But they were concerned about a land invasion of the continental United States by the Soviet Army aboard the Soviet Navy, which was as large as the United States was and a very capable Navy. And so they wanted to develop devices that would enable us to gather intelligence about what the extraterrestrials and the former Soviet Union were doing, and also be able to operate in a military theater in which some of the technologies that we would have to possess counterforce were operating essentially in the invisible range of the electromagnetic spectrum, essentially to cope with potential adversaries who were in possession of time travel.
So Andrew, as I understand it, you were only 6 years old then. How did that feel for you to be taken into a very out of the ordinary situation?
Well, it was very astonishing, I would say even shocking. What happened was, we know I was age 6, and I can explain that, but essentially my father drove us from our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, to the old Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Wood Ridge, New Jersey, that he had originally been assigned to between 1952 and 55 to work on the ramjet. In fact, my dad first traveled to New Mexico conventionally to flight test the ramjet engine at the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico. So there were many, many different buildings there. That's the principal location in the United States where Allied aircraft were designed and manufactured during World War II. And so I remember him taking me up to Curtiss Wright. I remember going through a small air museum with about 8 to 10 absolutely beautiful reconditioned aircraft that had been designed by Glenn Curtiss, who was, as you undoubtedly know, an associate aerospace air designer along with the Wright brothers, hence the name Curtiss Wright. So we would go through that air museum and to a kind of a security post, and we were given access then to the engineering building and to Building 68, which was one of the many numbered buildings there. And in a room in Building 68, there at Curtiss Wright, about the size of, let's say, a high school classroom, was an object that consisted of two gray-colored armatures. They were elliptical booms that were standing on their bases that had been designed into the ellipses. So they were standing there. They were about 8 feet tall, about 10 feet apart on the ground. And my dad, the left boom was connected to a rudimentary computer console that a technician was sitting behind. He was sitting behind a keyboard and a rudimentary screen. The right boom was attached to an industrial strength power cord and plugged into the power outlet in the wall. And my dad instructed the technician to turn the device on, and we stood about 10 feet away from the radiant energy that began to be broadcast between the two booms. This device had been one of the devices that had been found in schematic form in the papers of Nikola Tesla that were seized by the War Department upon Nikola Tesla's death in New York City on January 7th of 1943. And the War Department forwarded Tesla's papers to the world's leading physicists that were then gathering in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the atomic bomb. And what we didn't know is that Tesla's papers were never lost. They were forwarded to the Project Manhattan physicists. Individuals like Enrico Fermi, for example, who's one of the hidden progenitors of the U.S. time travel capability. So my dad had the technician turn the device on, and the radiant energy that Tesla had discovered as a form of energy that was latent and pervasive in the physical universe suddenly was illuminated between the two booms. And it was very beautiful. It looked like water falling in a public sculpture, such as you'll find in a park where the sculptor has used falling water as a design element. But then my dad had us go up a foot from the energy field, and it looked like black and white raster on a television set, the snow pattern that you get particularly in the old black and white TV sets. And I could see that emanating from portals that were about 3 inches apart on the interior or concave side of both of these elliptical shaped booms, there were small ports that were emitting a bluish green light pattern that was moving across the radiant energy, sort of squiggling like a tadpole swimming along in the water. And my dad explained that on the count of 3, we would hold hands and jump through the energy pattern, this field of radiant energy. And we would find ourselves in an illuminated tunnel for several seconds. And then the tunnel would close, and we would find ourselves, as he put it, on a hillside elsewhere in the United States. Well, in fact, the hillside was the state capitol grounds in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a distance of some 2,005 miles from Woodbridge, New Jersey. So we did a couple of dry runs where he held my hand and we practiced leaping forward on the count of 3.
How did you feel?
I was astonished. For one thing, I looked over at my father when we were in the tunnel, and his hair was moving all over the place because of the sort of electrostatic energy. He later said that I looked absolutely terrified.
Oh, really?
Essentially overwhelmed because we were moving through a vortal tunnel in time space that was illuminated in a bluish white glow. When I looked to the left and the right, I could see adjacent timelines. I could see events in holographic form that were visible in the walls of the vortal tunnel, almost like a almost like a television image, but there was basically a rapid series of these holographic images because we were cutting through other timelines between Woodridge in real time and Santa Fe in real time. And I was just astonished as to the environment that I found myself in. And essentially that was the incident in which I leaped into the U.S. time-space program, because at the end of that journey, we drove from Santa Fe up to the Los Alamos National Labs and met with Dr. Agnew. And he asked my father my age, and we said 6. So I think that's an important event, both leaping through the device at that time and then meeting with Dr. Agnew at the time that I was age 6, because that means that the U.S. defense technical community was secretly in possession of a physical teleportation technology by 1967-68, which means that they spent, 25 years tinkering with the different schematics that Tesla had left in his lab manuals, and they discovered that that one was a teleporter, and they were using it by 1967-68.
Now, when you're telling me about the tunnel, I then think of the stories you hear of near-death experiences of people mentioning they travel through a vortal tunnel. Could it be that it's a similar type of experience?
Yes, I think there are direct comparisons between the kind of physical teleportation that the Tesla or vortal teleporter allows and so-called instances of spiritual teleportation. Because in certain energetic states, when you have, for example, a human being who is an avatar and is in possession of more potential use of their brain or perhaps even their soul than the average human being, or when you're talking about the dense energy field that radiant energy is, clearly the same process ultimately is working, because whether it's the brain or mind of a human being spiritually teleporting, or it's a device that opens up that vortal tunnel, people do report spontaneous events where under some condition of great stress, for example, a survival crisis, they suddenly move through the physical universe in a non-ordinary way involving a tunnel. In fact, when I was fact-finding in New Mexico, I took 3 lengthy fact-finding trips to New Mexico in 2003, 4, and 8 to go back and find the locations that my father and I had visited in Project Pegasus and try to find some of the surviving family members of his friends from that time and so forth. And those ended up being 3 very successful trips. I basically proved my involvement in Project Pegasus by taking those trips, those investigations. But just serendipitously, during the 2004 trip, I met a woman named Kathleen at the State Capitol Complex in Santa Fe, New Mexico, who sadly had been struck by a car in the middle of the street and had her skull fractured. Her brain was shown. And she described how a man had come out of a house to help her, and she had asked for an ambulance, and he didn't come out of the house, either because he was taking too much time calling 911, or he had just decided to not help her. And she describes getting up with a fractured skull and having a flash of images where she went to one location, and then there was a flash of another set of images, and she reached her mother's house in a time in which, when she recovered fully, thank God, from her injuries, she became a marathon runner, and she could not run between the accident site and the mile or 2 to her mother's house at the speed that she did between the time of the accident and her mother's intervention at her mother's house. So we know that under life-threatening crises, people can literally overcome the ordinary bounds of the time-space continuum and essentially spiritually teleport. And we, of course, have examples of great religious and philosophical avatars in human history doing something similar. So we know that the human spirit is capable of overcoming the bounds of the physical universe. The benefit of the physical teleporters that were left as a result of the brilliant work of Nikola Tesla is that a technology can be turned on, a device, and enable anybody to teleport at any time, not just because they're a Mahatma, a great soul, but or an ordinary human being in an extraordinary life-threatening crisis, but simply as a result of going to a public teleport.
So why are we not using this today, Andrew?
What happened, and in fact the reason I'm speaking out, and what is in fact the hidden history of the U.S. time travel capability, is that the different devices were weaponized during the Cold War. The Tesla teleporter was hoped would allow U.S. troops to be placed precisely where they were needed on the battlefield. the electro-optical devices called chronovisors, which propagate moving holographic images of past and future events, were clearly an advanced intelligence gathering technology. So as these different forms of what I call quantum access, the ability to use a technology to send somebody to a distant location in the time-space continuum, or to gather remote images of a non-local event, an event scenario in what we call the past or future, they all were weaponized as classified defense technologies during the Cold War and kept back from the public. And I believe that has been a disaster. I mean, imagine that you're in London and you want to get home to New Zealand, back to Auckland. Instead of taking 24 hours sitting aboard a commercial airplane, having a higher risk of blood clots and other medical events, sitting on cramped in an airliner.
Yeah, cramped especially.
You could go through a vortal tunnel in time-space and reach Auckland in several seconds. In the case of the chronovisors, imagine the renaissance in education and science and the interest of young people in applied science, which we need more of. If they could go to a museum, let's say the National Museum in their country, and view moving holographic images of the auspicious events, not just in the life of their countrymen and women, but in the life of the human race. This technology has also been available, not just theoretically, but practically available to humanity since around 1970, when we were small children. And from 1970, literally the time that Al Gore was sitting in his college class in Harvard, in Dr. Roger Revell's greenhouse effect seminar,
I remember the talk.
Called climate change or global warming, studying the effects of the carbon dioxide from traditional forms of transportation, conventional ones like airplanes. We could have been moving around the world in seconds with no input or output, that is, of carbon dioxide from transportation, which is contributing 60% of the greenhouse gases that are affecting climate change. So we really are stuck in the 1970s. I think it's an emergency, and I think to the extent that global population is going to go from 7 billion to 9 billion by 2045, I'm making it my life's work to achieve the declassification and deployment of Tesla teleportation for transport in real time, not for time travel, but for the fastest, safest, least costly, most environmentally benign form of technology that we have, which is teleportation via the vortal teleporters that Tesla left.
How risky is it?
Well, back when we were doing it as small children, they were training a cadre of American school children to become the next adult cadre of U.S. chrononauts. So they were purposely using us from childhood to get us accustomed to the different forms of time travel. Back then, it was a new, dangerous, and experimental technology because they had just achieved the vortal teleportation with that particular device from Tesla's shop manuals around 1967-68, based on the conversation that was held between my father and Dr. Agnew during that first teleporting that I took with my father. So when I was placed in the program officially in the fall of 1969, I knew that there were several mishaps, and I was a witness to one of them. One thing that happened is one of the young girls in the program looked up at the crystal array hanging from the ceiling of one of the chronovisors, which was so dense as a light source that it could actually have a lensing effect whereby a non-local event was holographically portrayed or broadcast into the laboratory. Well, as a result of the brightness of that light, she lost her vision permanently. She was blinded. I was witness to a mishap where one of my same-age peers, we were jumping into an abandoned school site in Santa Fe to prepare us for having the experience of performing espionage in foreign countries as groups of children would be jumped in simultaneously from different teleports around the United States. And one of the boys arrived in that abandoned school site. It was an abandoned middle school. And unfortunately, one of the public fountains had not been completely drained or had filled up with rainwater or was leaking. And so he arrived standing in that public fountain, standing in about 3 inches of water. And because of the specific gravity of the water, the part of his body where the surface of the water was, which was about at the middle of his ankles, arrived a split second after the rest of his body. And so he slid off his ankles and tumbled out of the fountain, having been detached from his feet. And when I reached his location, I had popped into view via the teleporter that I jumped through, and he clearly accessed that location from some other teleporter around the eastern United States. He was writhing on the ground, screaming, my feet, I'm only 9 years old. What am I going to do without any feet? So when I considered the fact that some of my contemporaries in childhood had lost their sight or had lost their feet as children, giving humanity new ways of going places and seeing things in the universe, I felt morally compelled to bring this information forward because of the price that they had paid.
While you've been talking, Andrew, I've noticed from the corner of my eye that my colleague Gary got a big fascination on his face when we were speaking about the tunnel. Did you want to share something about that, Gary?
Yeah, I guess I can, Andrew, because back in 1974, I had one of those so-called near-death experiences, which in those days was an unknown thing as far as I was concerned, and I never heard of it, let alone a phenomena. And of course, it's the tunnel. It's going down that tunnel. You're aware of light and sound around you, but it stretches out forever. And there was a never-ending bend in it. I was not going around the bend. And of course, where I went with my reaction, anaphylactic reaction to bee stings, of course, everything stopped, and I was pronounced dead until a doctor revived me. And of course, my first thought was, at that time, when I heard the doctor's voice coming through saying, I think we've saved him, I think we've got him, my reaction was, no, leave me where I am, I don't want to come back. So there was no sort of, a flight of stairs going up there and all sorts of people from my past or the Creator waiting to welcome me or send me back. But interesting, and I could just see parallels in what you explained to us and what you experienced. So it is wonderful that in times of trauma, we can go places.
Yes, and bodily, because, for example, Kathleen showed up physically in front of her mother's house in a time that she wasn't able to go back and run in the same time period after fully recovering and becoming a marathon runner. And also, when we were jumping through the Bortle tunnel the Tesla device propagates, what happens is you essentially, as you leap through the radiant energy, your inertia opens up a bubble in time-space, sort of an interstitial chasm that is very like the tunnel that is reported in the near-death experience. The paradox is that it's illuminated, and there doesn't seem to be any external light source. And there's a low humming sound. I have no idea where that was coming from. And we were doing it physically. We were going through the universe physically. And what I've learned since then, in fact, is that space is exceptionally dense. In fact, 1 meter of space has as many ergs of energy stored in it as all of the grains of sand on every beach on Earth. So we're talking about an exceptionally densely energetic universe that nonetheless, Tesla discovered a form of energy that is pervasive in that physical universe that we can sort of tune in and then jump through. I'm not a physicist, but that's what I learned we were doing. He had found this form of energy. The device was basically a tuning device that broadcast that form of energy between the two elliptical-shaped armatures of the teleporter. And when that curtain of shimmering radiant energy was manifest in the laboratory, we were jumping through it physically and popping out thousands of miles away in several seconds. Now that could revolutionize transportation aboard our planet. So there's no reason why we shouldn't have attempted to introduce civilian teleportation in the 1970s, which was my father's position. In fact, he was constantly advocating it when I was in his presence in New Mexico when we were on the project.
And Andrew, there is a television show called Fringe. Have you heard of it?
I've not only heard of it, but after I introduced my life story to ABC Disney in January of 2008, a number of my story elements have appeared in Fringe. In fact, you may recall the episode where Walter Bishop held his the hand of his young son, Peter. Well, that was inspired by Raymond Basiago holding the hand of his young son, not Peter, but Peter's brother in the New Testament, Andrew, and jumping through the device at Curtiss Wright, which I just described at the top of the show.
That's interesting. My producer saw that episode and she nudged me to make sure I'd ask you that question. So.
Yeah, Fringe has been partly inspired by my experiences. For example, the word chronovisor appeared before in the West, or let's say in America, having been developed by the two Vatican priests, Ernetti and Gemelli in Italy, two Vatican musicologists at the Catholic University of Milan in the 40s and 50s. But essentially, the fact that I described my chronovisor experiences in that presentation to ABC Disney, I think also led Chronovision to be introduced as a story element in Fringe.
This seems to be happening quite a lot with actual real information that's being planted as little seeds in Hollywood films and TV shows.
Yeah, I have a lot more faith in film. I think that television almost culturally, almost addictively can't tell the truth if it's a controversial truth. So they insist on telling non-ordinary fact as fiction. Whereas I think Hollywood has told a lot of unusual stories that follow reality much more closely.
Maybe we're even creating the realities based on the films.
Well, I think there's a feedback, and also, science fiction was introduced as a genre during and after World War II to confuse other countries and the public about the secret advent of particular technologies. For example, around the time that the Tesla teleporter was understood to be a teleporter and introduced in the U.S. defense technical community secretly around 1966-67, Star Trek debuted on American TV, showing an entirely opposite form of teleportation. So what they tend to do is they tend to tell the basic story with sort of denatured facts. So they make the public aware of what teleportation might be or is, but then they describe it in a way that wouldn't allow anybody else to achieve it. So they introduced basically a fictional form of teleportation. The form of teleportation on Star Trek is quantum teleportation, which has led to so many of the contemporary science news articles about individuals who are working in quantum teleportation. And in that form of teleportation, you disintegrate the teleportee at the point of embarkation and then reintegrate their cellular material at the point of destination.
Okay.
And the problem with that is that would kill any living organism. So we're going to need, and we have already achieved, vortal teleportation, where the opposite happens.
Yeah.
Where a vortal tunnel is opened up and the teleportee passes through it.
And we stay intact. I've always been interested with these types of things, that what comes with us and what doesn't. I mean, to what extent are we able to bring something with us?
Well, something that's unattached can fall off in the vortal tunnel, like let's say a hat. But most articles of modern clothing are sort of ultimately tubular. In other words, they're sort of stuck to our body as a result of sticking our arms and legs through them. And our shoes, of course, or sneakers are usually tied on with our shoelaces and so forth. So anything that's going to stay on your body in a windstorm is going to stay on your body in these vortal tunnels and the other forms of physical time travel. But I did have items of clothing wrenched off my body during some of my time travel experiences, to include my hats and even my shoes. I mean, when I was sent to Gettysburg in 1863 via plasma confinement, my shoes were literally wrenched off in the violent wormholing that I passed through to get to the destination. So it's very much like a wind tunnel. If it can withstand staying on your body in that environment, it will stay with you during the teleportation.
Yeah. So for the viewers, that might be interesting as well, that there's a whole interview by Andrew on a radio station called, is it Coast to Coast?
Right. My first mainstream radio appearances were on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie in November of 2009, and then in November of 2010, we did two major exposés of the secret U.S. time travel capability. And in fact, I ended up convincing a supermajority of listeners. 65% of listeners believed me, 20% did not, and the other 15% had no opinion. So I actually got more support during that 2009 interview than the men who were elected governors of New York and California got being elected governor.
That might come in handy when you run for presidency.
Yeah, I think that I've silenced my critics now, I think, to a factual certainty, because I had spent 10 years before that first Coast to Coast AM interview, going back and actively investigating, doing hours and hours, probably over 1,000 hours of field investigation and of memory work to go back to all of my experiences, the location, describing the time travel technologies, describing their provenance, their function, the effects that they cause, the places I visited. So I essentially I'm in possession of an insider's account of the emergence of time travel secretly in the U.S. Defense Technical Community under DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So for those who have approached my whistleblower testimony with an open mind, they know that I'm telling the truth, just based on the amount of information I brought, the consistency of it. I've never been caught in an inconsistency or a lie, because I'm telling the truth. I resolve to not embellish. In fact, I've held back a lot that I think may have been going on as well that I can't factually describe. So I think I've prevailed. I think that those who are aware of my story know that I'm telling the truth, and in fact I am. But I'm the first to come forward and tell the true history. So it had a major effect on the Coast to Coast AM listening audience.
Yeah, that's great.
Then when I started linking the President of the United States to the Jump Room program, then I've been I haven't been blacklisted. They told me I'm still.
No, you haven't been blacklisted. That's quite something. How did you? Is that a little payoff for the services you've provided as a child?
I don't know. I mean, I gave the United States Defense Department 8 years of my life.
Exactly.
Four in childhood, 4 critical years in childhood, age 7, 8, 9, and 10, going on 11, or to age 11. And then I was in the Jump Room program from 1980 to 84, which were the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th years of my 5-year course of study at UCLA. I was a 5th-year senior, as it were. And I wasn't paid anything, so all I have is my memory. So I'm glad that the American civilization rewarded me to the extent that it put me on the biggest radio show in the world. At the same time, I really deserved to have been paid. I have scars on my body from what happened.
Wow.
Yeah, I take heavy scars.
So the Jump Room program, we will not be able to get into that today, unfortunately. But this is to do with teleportation to Mars, basically, isn't it?
Well, we went to Mars. We don't know if we were being teleported there or we could have been chronovized, because there were some holographic effects that occurred that suggested that we were visiting a form of Mars, but maybe not. We might not have been in direct contact with terrestrial Mars. So I think we were partly being chronovized there, just as I had been sent to Gettysburg. Not Gettysburg, that was plasma confinement, but sent to the Lincoln assassination site, for example, or the time of the dinosaurs, or actually the Netherlands around 1800. I was in your home country as an 8 or 9-year-old.
Really?
When a typical rural house was basically just a big barn with a huge windmill next to it.
Wow.
And this Dutch farm woman pulled me out of an irrigation canal and walked me into the house, and it was just like a big, well-appointed barn, and sat me at her table and served me sort of this leek soup. The whole village came into her house, and I was sitting there almost like in an inquest, and there were about 20 villagers sitting in 3 tiers, and the elder of their neighborhood, a man, was questioning me in Dutch. He was saying, like, English, Latin? He thought apparently I was a British boy, because I think they could detect that I was speaking English, who may have fallen into the English Channel and had been carried over to the Netherlands. But I was actually questioned in Holland probably almost 200 years before you were born.
Oh my God, this is great. So Andrew, when you're being chronovized, does this mean that you have no influence in the setting that is being played out around you?
Oh, you're there. When you're chronovized to location, we were being sent there as a kind of a supraluminal superimposition over that event scenario in time-space. So we could see and be seen by other sentient beings. And in fact, they sent me back to brief General Washington to advise him to retreat from New York Harbor in what then became the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. So that in August of 1776, that was critical in terms of the Revolutionary Army not being decimated. They had some reason to try to reinforce that decision by sending me back and having me actually meet Washington and advise him. George Washington was an impeccable individual. I still have a vision of him in my mind. He was so brilliant. He was almost illuminated with a white light. He was that striking in person. So in those cases, when I was going back in time via chronovision, I was indistinguishable from somebody from that time period. Washington even asked us whether we were angels, and I showed him a two-dimensional hologram that had been laminated, a sheet of paper with a two-dimensional hologram with laminate over it, to show him that we were from the future. I said, General Washington, there certainly isn't anything like this in your time. I hope this convinces you that we're time travelers from the future. But he initially asked us whether we were angels. So we think that our meeting with Washington may have actually led to that legend that George Washington had been advised by angels during the Revolutionary War. So we could see and be seen. We weren't either invisible entities nor otherwise. We were there in a light pattern that human beings and animals from that time period would see as an ordinary human being.
Okay, that's interesting. My colleague Gary and I, we went out into the bush about 7 months ago to make a documentary about the fairy folk of New Zealand. And when we came home in the evening and we spotted our footage, we noticed that while we were in the bush, there were 2 or 3 illuminated white beings behind us. And as we zoomed in, they were looking at us from behind a tree, and as soon as they realized they were being filmed, they went back. All you could see was the humanoid shape, white, glowy. And after watching your interview, or listening to your interview on Coast to Coast, I had this funny theory that I thought, well, perhaps these were people from the future.
We're dealing with many different types of beings, and they've all been documented. There are angels, who are essentially messengers from the heavenly realm, basically the eternal realm that this temporal realm emanates from. There are time travelers from other dimensions, from our own future. We have extraterrestrial visitors that are both biological entities and non-biological entities that are using time travel devices to get here at this time-space coordinate. So it's really all of the above. And from the reckoning of somebody like General Washington, who was clearly from the privileged class in the colonies and was literate and had as much access to books as anybody in that time and place could have had, from his place of understanding as a Christian growing up in the New World, he imagined that we had to be angels because of the depictions of angels in the Bible, where, for example, there are several angels appear to advise Lot to leave Sodom, and they were described as basically human beings in white clothing and very bright looking. And then we have the 2 angels that appeared in Jesus's crypt. So Bible-educated Westerners like Washington would have conceived of these unexplained visitors as angels, and that's what he was questioning us. He even asked it several times. He said, well, tell me, you are angels, aren't you? And I said, no, sir, we are visitors from your own future. In fact, I was given a script that I had to memorize. It was basically, it's been 40 years, but I was basically, I had to memorize a script that basically said, General Washington, we are time travelers from your own future. The 1970s, not the 1770s. So 20 years from your own future, or 200 years from your own future. I told him that you are destined to win the war that you are currently waging. It will lead to the forming of a new country called the United States of America. After a period of governance under some provisional presidents, you will be recognized as the first president of the United States and as the father of your country. And that country's capital will be named after you. It will be called Washington, District of Columbia. But none of those propitious things will happen if you do not retreat your troops immediately from New York Harbor. Your army will be decimated and you will lose the war. So this is one of the mysteries of some of the missions that we were sent on. We were sent to basically reinforce several critical moments in history, and this was one of them. In the case of going to the Gettysburg Address, that was sort of a treat. It was sort of a privilege that I was given because I had performed ably and well during the first 3 years of my involvement in the program. And my father and Dr. Sterling Colgate stated that they would now give me the opportunity to see the Gettysburg Address as it was happening.
Andrew, I'm aware that we need to start, unfortunately, slowly ending the interview. I could talk for not only hours more, probably days more, if it was up to me. Probably also a lot of questions are still coming up for me, and I'm sure for the people around me and the viewers possibly as well. So I would just like to ask one more question, and that is, how were crystals and sacred geometry used with the teleportation process?
Let me take the issue of sacred geometry first. Nikola Tesla once stated that if you could understand the secret of 3, 6, and 9, you would know one of the keys to the universe. So I have to believe that somehow a crystalline construct of 3, 6, and 9 may explain how the radiant energy that is in the universe was being captured by the Tesla device and used as a means to open up a tunnel as an interstitial chasm in the fabric of time-space. And the reason that that statement by Tesla is so important to understanding what we were doing is that 3 of the project principals told me personally that Project Pegasus owed its greatest debt of gratitude, technically, to Nikola Tesla. And that was my father, Raymond, that was Jack Pruitt, who was one of the team leaders, and also Dr. Robert Beckwith, the very prominent American electrical engineer and inventor, were constantly referencing the debt of gratitude that the project owed Tesla. So Project Pegasus would not have achieved operational time travel had Nikola Tesla not pioneered it and left the documents regarding it in his papers when he died in 1943. Now, the other issue is the role specifically of crystals. What we know, again, when I questioned my father about this issue, is that the electro-optical devices called chronovisors that the Catholic priest musicologist Ernetti and Gemelli had accidentally discovered as a means of retrieving a signal from a past or future event and amplifying and lensing it into the laboratory, the so-called chronovisors, were propagating the hologram that they were via driving an electromagnetic signal through an 8-sided array of polished bismuth crystals. Bismuth is element 83. So the emergent technology involving crystallography in the 20th century, the development of radio by Tesla and Marconi, for example, and the work that was done before and after World War II on crystallography led to the development of the chronovisor. Now, of course, crystals are faceted. Maybe that relates somehow to the 369 pattern that Tesla referenced. But yes, I would have to say that sacred geometry was germane to the development, probably, of teleportation, because that was the principal contribution that Tesla contributed to the U.S. time-space program when it emerged, and these devices were fully operational by 1970. And we know that the crystals were at the heart of the applied holography that was allowing the program to retrieve a residual signal from a past event or an emergent or potential signal from a future event and amplify it and bring it into the laboratory.
Andrew, thank you so very much for taking the time to do this with us. I think it's very timely that we start bringing out this information en masse globally.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly, and I'm so thankful for you allowing me to share my experiences with the people of your beautiful country, New Zealand. I think that very soon we're all going to be linked by teleports located in major world cities. First, having them be put in place at major world airports in major world cities to link the world with a form of transportation that will allow us to move between major world cities around the world in seconds. And I think when that happens, we'll recognize that fundamentally there's only one race on the planet, and it's the human race, and that we're going to recognize that we're 7 billion team members aboard a spherical planet as a spaceship Earth.